الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين أبي القاسم محمد وآل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. أما بعد فقال الله تبارك وتعالى وقوله الحق وهو أصدق القائلين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. Greetings and felicitations on this very auspicious night, the night known as the night of Bi'sat, Mab'uth Bi'risalat. Our Prophet was Mab'uth Bi'risalat, which means that, of course, he was Nabi before the birth of Adam ﷺ, but the beginning of his mission and the beginning of his Risalat is at the age of 40 in the cave of Hira, when he received these first verses of revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, in order to understand the background of all of this, and I'll get into the ayat that I recited briefly, that Prophet was sitting on the mouth of the cave. Many of you have visited, and now there's a monorail that is being built around it, so it can take you easily up there. Nonetheless, Rasulullah used to climb up there. Those of you who had gone before the turn of the century, it was actually the actual, mountain that you had to climb. I had the opportunity to climb the actual mountain. Now there are steps available. And going up there was not an easy task by any stretch of imagination. Rasulullah used to stay there reminiscing about his childhood, about his youth years and his adulthood. He was thinking about the social status of the city of Makkah, the people that lived in that city, and the halat and the conditions of these people, and the tanazzul and continuous downfall of these people as far as idol worshipping was concerned, moral vices were concerned, poverty of the needy and the deprived, which the wealthy were not taking care of. All of these things, of course, which wouldn't align with Rasul's faith as well as his intellect. So he wanted to solve the problems of the city of Makkah, and therefore what did he used to do? He used to sit there and contemplate. I guess from there we have the idea of tafakkuru sa'atin afdal min ibadat masalan 70 sana. That when you do contemplation for 1 hour is better than doing ibadat for 60 years or 70 years. Today you offer, in ibadat and amal, which is better than the amal of many years. Tomorrow when you fast, as I mentioned before, that fast is superior to the ibadat of 60 years. Allah gives, and He's capable of giving. And therefore, we understand these amal should not be taken for granted. A lot of times people say, well, there's so many amal in the book of Mafatihul Janan, and meaning you have nothing else to do but to do these amal. There's an amal for every single day of the month of Rajab. Many requested, so I've been sharing the salat for every single night. Don't expect me to be offering those salat, but I've been sharing it with you, so I'll be very honest. But those, mashallah, community members, they want to offer these prayers and these, special nights that we have. Therefore, someone asked one of the scholars as to, there's so many amal in Mafatihul Janan. By the way, Sheikh Abbas Qumi, I've heard about it, that when he wrote this book, he did not publish it right away. When he compiled it, what is it? It's a compilation. He compiled it from different older books of du'as, and he put it together in a very systematic way, which is it's month-wise and day-wise. And so he did not release this book, I've heard from many ulama, until he offered and did everything by himself. And then he released this book. So that tomorrow if someone says, Molana, you got all of these amal listed in this book, have you done it yourself? He could easily say, yes, I've done every single thing that is written in this book, before I went ahead and gave it to anyone else. That shows, you've done it yourself, you perform it, and you're not just exhorting others to do it. You have physically and you have yourself performed those amal. With that said, Rasulullah would be sitting and he would be reminiscing as to what is going on, and he would contemplate. With this contemplation, of course, he knew that he's a Nabi. It's not like he's and does not know, but there's very little that he can do at that moment because of all of the shirk that is happening around him. So Prophet was 40 years old. All these worries led him to spend majority of his time in seclusion on this cave, inside this cave, on this Mount Hira, contemplating and worshipping so that God might put an end to this whirlpool of calamities. And therefore, he would spend Rajab, Shaban, and Ramadan in that cave of Hira, worshipping and doing the ibadah. On that one night, on the 27th of Rajab, Hazrat Jibreel Amin appears before Rasulullah and reveals and recites these ayat to him. Now, of course, riwayat of Ahl Sunnah and Ahl Tashayyuh both agree on the fact that Jibreel Amin asked Rasulullah, Iqra. And so Rasulullah responded by saying, وَمَا أَنَا بِقَارِئ. And he had not read anything from the worldly texts. Not having read does not mean he does not know how to read. But this is where the question was. Just pay attention to this point. All of the wahi that came onto Rasulullah, did it come down on a piece of paper? Was it on a tablet that Hazrat Musa brought? It was all given to him through Jibreel Amin, and he would receive it shafa'an, right? With love. And he would go ahead and tell others. He didn't even have to read this. If you say Rasulullah was not able to read, so it was not being revealed on a piece of paper anywhere for him to be able to read. It was being informed and ilham was being done to him by Jibreel Amin, or dictation was being done to him by Jibreel Amin. So Jibreel would appear to Rasulullah and he would recite Iqra, and he would say, Iqra, read. Rasulullah asked 3 times, what should I read? And then he says, Iqra, Bismi Rabbika alladhi khalaq. Read in the name of your Rabb, the one who created you. He said, Khalaq al-insana min alaq. Read in the name of your Rabb, the one who created man from a clinging mass. Wa iqra wa rabbuka al-akram. Read, and your Lord is most generous, who taught men by the pen, taught man what he did not know. These were, Mufassirin agree upon the fact, were the first ayat that were revealed onto our Prophet. Allah although says the entire surah was revealed because of the such close connection that these ayat have with one another, that there's no reason for them to be revealed separately. But nonetheless, riwayat are equal in our books of history as well. Rasulullah received this mission. Now he knows the purpose, he knows the maqsad of Bi'sat. He leaves Kaaba. Now he knows what he wanted to do, what he had been contemplating about. The time has come for him to start the propagation. So what does he do? First thing, he comes down to the house of Bibi Khadija, salamullahi alayha, tells her about what he has received. Right away, amanat bih. She was the first one to bring iman onto him, comfort him. At this point, he had asked her that, oh Khadija, provide me, I feel shivering. There's nothing wrong. Rasulullah is not. He's overwhelmed with having spoken to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You get the same feeling. There's nothing degrading his maqam or his status if he feels this way. This is the word of Allah coming down to him. And this is still at the same time Nabi of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore those ayat from Surah Muddassir were also revealed later on, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called him Ya ayyuhal Muddassir or Ya ayyuhal Muzzammil. But nonetheless, he comes down and he tells her, she confirms and she believes in him, and that's where the decision of the Risalah begins. This surah, very briefly I want to talk about as to what this surah talks about. Because we only focus on the first 5 ayat, and the rest of the ayat we'll just skip past. We never get to talk about that. So, the contents and the topics of this surah starts by instructing the Prophet to read and to recite the Quran. After the highlights the exalted place of humans, and then talks about, although you are exalted, albeit you're created from a najis fluid. While the exalted nature of insan is mentioned, but also you're being humbled because of your beginning. In the next stage, he discusses the evolution of man in the light of Allah's mercy and Allah's grace and His lutf and His familiarity with the science and knowledge. That is the second part of the surah. The third stage, he talks about the ungrateful people. Now, while there are people who are thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and showing gratitude towards Him, there's also a group of people who are what? They're still going to show kufr and their ungrateful nature. Despite all the blessings and honors of God, take the path of rebellion. And then finally, it refers to the painful punishment of those who hinder people's guidance. Not only that these people don't want to be guided themselves, but they become an obstacle in front of others to be guided as well, and to perform amal and good deeds. The chapter ends with the instruction to do sajda and seeking nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Salawat bi Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The Prophet read whatever the angel of revelation asked him to read. When he left the cave, this time he came down with a heavy weight of nubuwwat, right? The heavy weight of risalat onto him. And therefore, this khatmiyat of nubuwwat and the khatmiyat of risalat, that weight is on his shoulders now. He would tremble with allure of the divine love. And when he reached home, he asked Hazrat Khadija to wrap him in a cloak. That's the revelation. Ya ayyuhal muddathir, fa'andir, wa rabbika fakabbir. O you wrapped up in a mantle, rise up and warn, magnify your Lord. Prophet explained to Hazrat Khadija what had happened, and she of course comforted him. In Tafsir Nabi, when the precept of creation were mentioned in this ayat, under this ayat, the Tafsir Nabi, when it talks about the creation of insan, in another place in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, what? Ma gharraka bi rabbika al-kareem. Allah introduces himself as Kareem, generous, right? That is in Surah Infitar, ayat number 6 and 7. Ma gharraka bi rabbika al-kareem, alladhi khalaqaka. Oh man, what has deceived you about your generous Lord, who created you and proportioned you and gave you an upright nature? The point that Tafsir Naween is trying to make over here is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created insan, Allah used the sifat of Kareem for himself. Right? He said, Rabbikal Kareem. But when the topic of discussion is reading and remembering the pen, Allah calls himself to be Akram. The difference over there, he called himself to be Kareem after creating insan. But when it comes to the education of insan, what did he say? Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, khalaqa al-insana min alaq, Iqra wa rabbuka al-akram. What is superior, Kareem or Akram? Akram is the superlative degree of karamat. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is distinguishing, while you are ashraful makhluqat, after creating you, Allah only called himself to be generous, Kareem. But after giving you the pen, he calls himself to be Akram, meaning there's nothing above the karamat and the generosity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore we see one of the distinctions of Islam in front of other religions is that it began by commanding insan to read knowledge and pen. The first message from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet is a cultural message to establish a farhang, right? Through pen, through writing, that concept of education is being mentioned. And not irony, that when the first revelation is Iqra, Surah Alaq, chapter 96, what is the second revelation? chapter 68. Noon wal qalam wa ma yasturun. Quran has two types of, alignments, or the surah, the way they are situated. One is the chronological order of revelation. You can find that online as well. And one is the order in which we have the Qurans. The surah Fatiha is the first surah, then surah Baqarah, then surah Al-Imran, then surah Nisa, surah Ma'idah, ila akhir, surah Nas. But the chronological order of revelation is not like this. Surah Fatiha was not the first one that was revealed. And we all know Surah Alaq was the first one that was revealed. What is the second surah that is revealed? Surah Qalam, chapter number 68. Muttafaq alayh. And that is also the Surah Imtiyaz. That is also the vain glory. That is also the point of the Quran, which is known as Mushaf Ali. Mushaf Amir al-Mu'mineen, that he compiled after the wafat of Rasulullah, that he would not come out of his house. He said, until I have finished compiling the Quran. What is the distinction of that Quran? That distinction is that all the surahs are in the order that they were revealed. And therefore it is something which is a common knowledge. The point that I'm trying to make over here is, Islam gathers you, tells you that the first ever wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to read. The second wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to write. What other deen promotes reading and writing more than what Islam promotes? Therefore, it should not be a case for mu'mineen and muslimeen to be left behind as far as reading and writing is concerned. And then the last nukta in regards to this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this very chapter, Surah Alaq, begins with Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq and ends with Wasjud. I won't read the entire ayat, or all of you will have to go into sajda, including me. But the last ayat says Wasjud, right? Meaning what? Go into sajda. The 4 chapters in Quran where there's a wajib sajda, right? What are those 4 chapters? Surah Alaq is one of them. Surah Najm is one of them. Surah Hamim Sajda is one of them. And Surah Fussilat is one of them. What are these chapters? Chapter 32, chapter 41, chapter 53, and chapter 96. Or another way of knowing, Juz 21, Juz 24, Juz 27, and Juz number 30. All of these ajza are 3 Juz apart. 21, 24, 27, and 30. In these 4 Juz, you have Wajib Sajda, or these 4 chapters. They're called Azaim. There's some fiqh rules that are associated with them. One of them is that you cannot recite any of these chapters in your salat. Because if you recite this chapter in your salat, when we get away, we don't have these chapters memorized anyway. But someone said, I'm going to read this chapter, and you hold the Quran in your hand and you wanted to read, for example, Surah Alaq or Surah Najm, or any of these chapters. I have time, I want to read in my Maghrib prayers. No, you're not allowed to. Why? Because when you do so, when you come to the ayat of sajda becomes obligatory right away. So you'll have to fall into sajda. And then you have to get back to your qiraat again. What have you done? You have added a rukn wajib into your salat wajib. Therefore, you have made your salat batil. But of course, our brothers of Ahl-Sunnah, they don't have any ishkal in reading. So if you are praying behind them and they happen to recite one of these surahs or part of this chapter, of course, that is going to also make your salat batil. But nonetheless, this is one fiqh aspect of it. Number 2 fiqh aspect of these 4 wajib sajda surahs was what? Is that you cannot recite Quran or these ayat in the halat of najasa. Right? One is of misconception that in the halat of najasa we cannot recite more than 7 ayat. No. Reciting more than 7 ayat do not bear any tawab. But it doesn't say you cannot recite. You cannot touch the words of Quran, but your gadget, you can read Quran off of this, and even if you touch the screen, there's nothing wrong with it. But in halat najasa, you're not allowed to touch the words of Quran. But you can recite more than 7 ayat. For men and women. In the halat of najasa, 7 ayat you get thawab. Beyond 7 ayat, there's no thawab. Or thawab is little, for example. But with that said, Even though in that halat, you're not allowed to recite any of these 4 ayat. So when you're reading Surah Allah, in the halat al-Najasa, so Molana said, I can read it off my Quran, so I'm going to read. Don't read this ayat, because that ayat entails sajda and wajib sajda, and you are in the halat al-Najasa, you're not allowed to read these. So these were the 2 fiqhi rulings that are associated with these Azaim Surah. Salawat Muhammad wa alihi The last point that I was trying to make, and that last point is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins the surah with what? With read. And He ends the surah with what? Do sajda. That tells you, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء. That ayat comes into play. That when you read and you become an alim and you become a scholar, alim does not mean someone who has a turban on their head. Alim means you have ilm, you have knowledge. When you become an alim, when you read, it should bring humility to you. So much so that you should fall in sajda and prostrate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Shouldn't be the case once you acquire some knowledge. Now you get away from doing the sajda of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You should not become the case of Fir'aun and Qarun and whatnot, that I do not need to go ahead and do this sajda anymore. That means, that tells you the ilm makes you humble. That is the reason the tree that is bearing fruits, the one that has the leaves, is humble and down to earth. But the tree that does not bear any of these things is straight up and erected in a sense that it does not bow down. So therefore, ilm brings what? Brings humility to you. Not in front of the people, does not make you to be, humiliated in front of people, but humility in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is the connection between ilm and sajda that is being mentioned over here. Iqra, you do qira'at, and then you fall into sajda. Also tonight is mentioned by some, is the night of meraj. Now, there is dispute about it, but nonetheless, since it's associated, we will mention a little bit about that as well. Rasulullah did not have one meraj. He ascended many times. Is it possible that Habib and Mahbub would only meet once? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had called Rasulullah many times. But one of those times happened to be on the 27th day of Rajab in some riwayat that is mentioned. Now, Rasulullah visited where? You have all heard the stories about it and the discussions about it for many years. In fact, in the book Irshad al-Daylami, there's a lengthy hadith which is a mukalima between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our Prophet. Rasulullah ascended to Miraj. Jibreel, I'm using these words loosely, gave him a tour. Showing him different places, meeting with different anbiya. It begs the question, where did Rasulullah visit? Was it Jannat? No, Jannat has not been established yet, right? What part of Jannat was it that Rasulullah was visiting? So there are 2 takes on it. One, it was temporarily made for Rasulullah's visit. Sometimes when you invite people, you can temporarily make shift, you can make something so that people come and they enjoy it and they leave. We do that all the time. So is it difficult for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have ad hoc makeshift Jannat for Rasulullah to visit and see firsthand what will be in Jannah? That is a possibility as well. Second, some ulama mentioned that it was the Jannat and Jahannam, because Rasulullah also saw, what will happen to those who are Jahannami. He saw the Jannat and Jahannam of Barzakh. And that is another possibility. But I like the first one, that Rasulullah saw a replica of the actual Jannat. He visited all the places. He saw a thorough visit was given to him. And he met all the different Anbiya. He went to different stations. And the lengthy hadith in Irshad al-Daylami speaks about that as well. But the mukalima that he had with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I want to tie that mukalima into Iqra wasjud, so that we conclude with that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to our Prophet, Allah addresses him as Ahmad. Why? Because his name on the Arsh Ilahi is Ahmad, and his name on the ground is Muhammad. So when he spoke to him, the hadith narrates as this: Ya Ahmad, هل تدري بأي وقت يتقرب العبد من المعبود. So one of the portions of the hadith is this. It's a lengthy hadith. We've talked about it actually on our Fajr program probably 10, 12 years ago. When we used to have the Fajr talks, and we spoke about this hadith, meraj. So one of the segments, one of my favorite segments of this hadith is this portion. Allah called him, Ya Ahmad, hal tadri. All of these questions were to Rasulullah. Now, if you were to ask questions to yourselves or to, scholars, they'll give you some answers. Rasulullah also knows the answer. But his ilm is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So out of inkisari, you're sitting in front of, no tashbih bila mushabbah, you're sitting in front of the marja. And the marja asks you a question. What are you going to say? You're going to say, you go ahead and explain. In your presence, I don't want to talk. You go ahead and tell us what this question and what the answer is. Right? Out of respect. Even though you might know the question, you might know the answer. But you say, no, you go ahead and mention, because it is possible that you will talk about the different jawanib of that question, and the answer will be mane and jame, meaning all ends, this answer will be the most perfect answer. So from that aspect, when Rasulullah was asked, hal tadri, or al tadri, ya Ahmad, bi ayyi waqtin yataqarrabu al-abd min al-ma'bud. When is my abd and my servant closest to his khaliq? Now Rasulullah probably knows the answer. But he responds by saying, La adri. I do not know. So don't take this La adri as, blasphemy. How can Rasulullah know something? No, this is in front of Malik Haqiqi. This is in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And number two, I just gave you an example. Everything that Rasul has is from Allah. So when he says, La adri, oh Allah, you explain. When is that time? I'm here to be educated. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds by saying, إِذَا كَانَ. This is called humility. This is called humbleness. Knowing, but yet asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I'm connecting that Iqra, Rasulullah is knowledgeable. He has ilm. And then he is humble in front of Allah. So Allah responds by saying what? إِذَا كَانَ الْعَبْدُ جَائِعًا أَوْ سَاجِدًا. When my abd is closest to me, when he is ja'i, empty stomach, in the halat of fasting and roza, was sajidan, and he's in the stage of sajda. When sajda and empty stomach combine, that is the time when my servant is closest to me. So therefore you attain this ilm, you attain this knowledge, which gives you to go ahead and fast, deprive yourself from all the tayyibat for a certain amount of time, and then you prostrate at that time, you will find yourself to be the closest as far as the proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah to give us the tawfiq and ability to be able to gain this proximity, especially in these months of Rajab, Shaban and Ramadan. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we gain the proximity of Munjiwat, Imam of our time, Imam Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala Sharif. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the barakat of this month and the barakat of month Shaban, that He raises us with Aimai Atar on the day of judgment. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the barakat of these months that He bestows upon us the shafa'at of Masumeen alayhi wa sallam. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to count us amongst the companions and the soldiers of Imam of time. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Inna Allaha wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi ya ayyuhalladhina amanu sallu alayhi wa sallimu taslima.